Hello, my name is Sam Howell Reading Wolf. This is my first book-related video. And today I'm going to talk about Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes, an excellent action thriller novel. If you have watched the animated movie about Tarzan, forget everything you know from that. The book Tarzan of the Apes is a significantly different beast. There are multiple differences between the two medias. The book is highly graphic and intense in its action scenes, while the movie is very tame. So pour yourself a cup of hot cocoa, tea, or whatever you prefer, grab some snacks, get comfortable, and let's dive in. It's going to be a bumpy ride, boys and girls. Tarzan starts with the premise of John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, has been commissioned to investigate the treatment of Africans by European powers, as there are reports and rumors of abuse, taking advantage of, and slavery treatments. John Clayton is quickly established to be an idealized representation of a male human, in looks, male physique, and character. Additionally, he is a man of good social status. He and his wife, the Lady Alice, board the Fuwalda. Both crew and captains are of a highly undesirable sort. Quote, their crews composed of the offscourings of the sea, unhanged murderers and cutthroats of every race and every nation. Her officers were swarthy bullies, hating and hated by their crew. The captain, while a competent seaman, was a brute in his treatment of his men. End quote. In the introduction to Tarzan, an introduction that, at least of the copy I have, it attests that the book has themes of racial inheritance. Quote, theories about racial inheritance abound in Tarzan of the Apes. Burroughs insists in good eugenicist fashion that the Nordic races are physically and intellectually superior to Mediterranean and Negro groups. End quote. The first part of that statement is correct, as many of Tarzan's good characteristics are attributed to being inherited from his father and his family line, in short, his pedigree. The latter part, however, you would be hard-pressed to find examples of. There are moments that I can see how some might have that impression, but the example the introduction shows is not one of them. It uses the description of the crew and officers of the Fuwalda as evidence of this claim. Quote, the mutineers on the Fuwalda are a case in point, described as the offscourings of the sea, unhanged murderers and cutthroats of every race and every nation, their inferiority and their villainy attributed to their mongrel origins. We learn also that Tarzan's sense of honor and self-control are attributes of his racial and class legacy. And Tarzan of the Apes, Burroughs doesn't miss an opportunity to make his position on race and heredity clear so as to appeal to like-minded readers. End quote. Again, some of this is true, at least in part. The accusation regarding the crew and officers of the Fuwalda, honestly, you have to squint really hard to make that assertion. It says, every race and nation. Clearly, you had a multiracial crew here. Every race and ethnicity was represented. No one was spared the stain of unhanged murderers and cutthroats. I would argue that Burroughs has a theme of humans themselves can be just as beastly as the animals, if not more so. And I think this becomes even more apparent as the story progresses. Now, the statement regarding what Tarzan's sense of honor and self-control are attributed to is at least partially true. It is indeed attributed to the family line he is descended from. So in that respect, yes, his race kind of, but again, more specifically, his family line and pedigree. This might be a splitting hairs argument, but I would say it's more about who his family line was and his upbringing. One thing I would like to note is the whole reason John Clayton got a ship for Africa, the rumors turn out to be true, which has effects later. It was not purely used as a driving force to get John Clayton heading towards Africa and then forgotten about. It is touched upon again later. Mutiny happens aboard the ship, and the captain is such that you don't really feel bad for him. One thing I would like to note is John Clayton has a sense of foreboding. There is nothing to support what sort of trouble will happen, but he has a sense of apprehensiveness and considers insisting on being put aboard a Navy ship he sees. But he ignores his intuition, chalking this up to cowardice. By ignoring his instincts and gut feelings, trouble that could have been avoided does indeed happen. So the Claytons are told that mutiny is indeed being planned by someone who assuredly is one of the mutineers. And I really admire Alice. One could say is a minor, almost inconsequential character. But I admire her here. She encourages her husband to inform the captain, despite their mutual dislike for the brute, not only in hopes the crisis might be avoided, but as their honorable duty. There was great personal risk in this, as telling anyone anything they had heard meant the deal regarding their lives being spared was off. She doesn't flinch or second guess. She fully encourages him to warn the captain, despite the personal risk involved. Mutiny does happen, and the Claytons are put somewhere on Africa, but we have no idea where. The reason for this is the mutineers would be asked questions at any port. Now, it is my belief that Burroughs likes putting a character in a situation that the individual is ill-equipped to deal with. This happens 3 times in Tarzan of the Apes. First time is John Clayton and Lady Alice putting them in the untamed jungles of Africa. The second is putting the infant Tarzan amongst wild animals, and Tarzan somehow survives long enough to reach maturity. The third is putting Tarzan in civilized society, something he knows nothing about and is ill-equipped to function in. I also would say Burroughs has this theme of humans, regardless of background and ethnicity, are just as capable of brutal, beastly, barbaric acts as the animals themselves. Arguably even more so. You have, of course, the mutineers. Later, cannibals will come up. More mutineers later, etc. Now, like in the Disney adaptation, John Clayton does construct a cabin for he and his wife to live in, and it is not just their own lives which are very much at risk, given where the Claytons are, but Lady Alice is expecting a young one. Now, while horror movies are not a big interest of mine, it is worth noting one could make a very good horror thriller just by adapting the early chapters of Tarzan, particularly those where the Claytons are trying to survive in the jungles of Africa, a task that neither is equipped with the skills that would make such a prospect hopeful. Some time transpires, and in that time, John Clayton has finished constructing the cabin, save for plans to build additional rooms inside it one day. One of the apes confronts him, a species that the author makes clear is similar to a gorilla, but also distinctly different. Clayton is intercepted by the gorilla, preventing him from retreating to the safety of the cabin. He calls to his wife to shut and bar the door. Alice here does something incredibly brave, not only in contrast to her temperament, but something brave for anyone. But she, who is always anxious about firearms, grabs one of the rifles and comes back out to attempt to shoot the bull ape. Again, this was very courageous of her, especially regarding her particular nature. She succeeds in firing the gun, but the ape charges upon her. Thankfully, no harm befalls her, and the ape falls dead. But Alice is never the same afterwards. The shock and the terror leave her in a state where she believes they are back in England, and that everything was a nightmare, and nothing will convince her otherwise. She was a very brave, strong woman in this moment. It is no wonder that the terror and shock of the moment negatively affects her, especially considering her timid nature. Tarzan is born, and then 1 year later, Alice dies. I would say of natural causes, as the cause of death is unspecified. But Alice was a presumably young woman, so that she died so young leaves one to speculate that perhaps the shock of the ape attack shortened her lifespan. There is nothing to confirm if this is the case or not. What we do know is that she did not die of disease or of some bestial attack. And at this, the hopelessness that John Clayton is in, little Tarzan is maybe 1 year old at this time, still in need of his mother to provide nourishment to him, and she has died. What is John Clayton to do? We now shift focus from the Claytons to the apes of the jungle. Kerchak, their leader, is in a frenzied rage, attacking all around him. Kayla, in an attempt to escape, leaps into the trees, but her young ape child falls from her grasp and dies from the fall. This, as we will see, causes her to forever remember. So some differences from the animated film. Kerchak is not Kayla's husband. She is married to an ape called Tublat, or Broken Nose. Yes, a most flattering name indeed. There is also no young gorilla that will be friends with Tarzan. Also, Kerchak is not anywhere near as honorable as he is portrayed in the film. If nothing else, he is shown to help defend and protect the young of the tribe. So unlike in the film, where Kayla stumbles upon the dwelling of Tarzan's parents and investigates out of curiosity, and finds Tarzan alive but his parents killed from the jaguar, Kerchak leads the tribe to the place of the Claytons with the intent of owning the rifle that had killed some of them, and to kill John Clayton as well. Again, this whole beginning setting of Tarzan would make an excellent premise for a horror movie. Kerchak kills John Clayton, turns his attention to the cradle, but Kayla snatches Tarzan before anything can be done, and escapes out of the cabin up into the treetops. And she becomes Tarzan's mother and provides him with the nourishment that he would soon need. Tarzan would have starved otherwise, but now he is thrust into a world where only the strong survive, and he is an infant human child in a world of gorillas, lions, and many other beasts. His chance of surviving to adolescence are incredibly slim, which is what I mean by Burroughs seems to like putting characters in situations that they are blissfully unprepared to cope with, and somehow manage to do exactly that. After finally mustering the courage to touch the item that had brought death to them, Kerchak and the others leave the cabin, but in so doing the door closes and latches, and the apes with their dull, bestial intellect would be unable to figure out how to open it, and what's inside is kept safe from harm. Kayla, remembering how her own child had died, takes extra care that Tarzan does not fall to the same fate, and is very careful in escorting him on the marches of the apes. Another thing with Tarzan is the other young apes advance and mature far more rapidly than Tarzan, gaining in size and strength quickly, reaching a point where they can fend for themselves, get food independently, etc., without assistance, whereas Tarzan is still as helpless as he was when first found, even though 12 months have transpired. Now, by the time Tarzan is 10, in matters of cunning and intellect, he surpasses his other ape brothers and sisters, but in size and strength, he is very much inferior to them. Despite this, Tarzan already surpasses the strength and athleticism of the average adult male. Now Tarzan reaches a point where he realizes he is different from his brothers and sisters, and this bothers him. He is not hairy like they are. He is much smaller than them. They have broader noses and stronger jaws, and this all embarrasses him. Tarzan is something of a prankster, and we get a little insight into this in Chapter 5. As it reads, Tarzan, on his part, never lost an opportunity to show that he fully reciprocated his foster father's sentiments, Tublat, who hated Tarzan. And whenever he could safely annoy him or make faces at him or hurl insults upon him from the safety of his mother's arms or the slender branches of the higher trees, he did so. End quote. So one thing Tarzan learned to do was to make ropes and nooses by tying grasses together, and with these he made trips. One day, he accidentally figured out how to lasso, and this was a game changer for Tarzan's mischievous schemes. Keep in mind that Tarzan likes tormenting Tublat in particular, as we see another instance of this behavior later. I will add that while we are not given the specifics of Tarzan's schemes against Tublat, it is made clear that these instances were numerous. I also want to state that I think this behavior makes sense, not only for a curious and mischievous boy of his years, but a boy who grew up among animals. Now, with this invention, Tublat never knew when Tarzan's noose would silently drop on him. It could be in his sleep, while drinking, when they were all marching. He never knew. And despite Tublat's threats, the rebukes from Kayla, or the warnings from Kerchak, Tarzan rebelled and defied them all. He continued his pranks despite all this. This invention and testing does give Tarzan an idea, though, that would not grow or come to fruition until later. But if he could snare Tublat or other apes with his lasso, why not Sabor the lioness? In Chapter 6, Tarzan, after much exploring, realizes that the door is the means of entry to the cabin his father made, and eventually figures out how to open it, and inside he finds, among other things, a knife with which he proceeds to cut himself. He then begins seeing what else he can cut and eventually tires of this game. So here's another instance of chance that will prove to be of great benefit happening to Tarzan. The first was the apes going to the Claytons' cabin right when Alice had died. Without Kayla, Tarzan would have died, and as we will soon see, without this knife, Tarzan again would have died. When Tarzan leaves the cabin, it has become dark, and a male gorilla confronts him. To be clear, this is a gorilla, not one of the apes that Tarzan lives with. Burroughs makes it clear that while Tarzan is extremely strong for one of his years, and of good pedigree and descent, he is still very outmatched. Despite all this, Tarzan meets the gorilla head-on without any visible sign of fear. As he jabs his fist at the beast, his knife plunges in. Thereby, Tarzan discovers a use for his new discovery. And this is what I meant earlier. Without the knife, Tarzan would have died here. Even with the knife, his chances are incredibly slim, but they are better than a guaranteed death. I also wish to state that while Tarzan kills this gorilla, it is no easy task, and leaves Tarzan sorely wounded. In fact, after this battle, he is very helpless for several days thereafter. The results of this fight are rather graphic. Once Tarzan recovers, he goes back to where his fight with the gorilla happened, so that he might retrieve his knife. This done, he proceeds back to his father's cabin and attempts to solve the mystery of the books in there, and what the letters mean, and are trying to say. He takes upon himself an impossible undertaking, learning to read without guidance, instruction, or direction of any kind. Now, Burroughs does attribute part of the success of learning to read and Tarzan's learning in general to the intelligence Tarzan had been gifted with by his parents and who he was descended from. I need to stress, though, that this is but part of the explanation and is not implied to be the whole reason, but this explanation does pop up. The apes that Tarzan lived with have a ritualistic celebration. An ape of another tribe had been killed, and so they feast on him, each striving to get a piece of the meat. Burroughs states that Tarzan especially craved and needed meat, being descended from a long line of hunters, and seizing a piece larger than he had hoped for, he is on his way to eat his piece in peace. Tublat, however, spies him, the object of his loathing, and also wants the meat Tarzan has. He chases after him, but Tarzan escapes into the higher limbs of the tree, where Tublat was too heavy to pursue. Tublat flies into a fit of rage and begins attacking his fellow apes. I'm not an expert on primate behavior, but I'm fairly positive that this is not a behavior of apes, despite Burroughs implying as such. But we're also talking about his fictional gorilla species, so take that as you will. The other apes begin fleeing, but one, Kayla, is hotly pursued by Tublat, and she nearly escapes, but the branch she was on broke, and she fell. Tarzan intercepts them, and grabbing Tublat by the throat, he repeatedly stabs Tublat until the latter falls dead. Now, unlike his first gorilla encounter, this one Tarzan doesn't suffer a mark, so another thing that you see in Tarzan is where Tarzan starts at the very bottom. The bottom of the bottom. And slowly, gradually, he climbs up. His first battle, he was victorious, but grievously wounded. Here, he killed an ape with a knife without suffering any harm to himself. And as the story progresses, he will mount even mightier than this. So remember why Tarzan's father was sent to Africa in the first place? The investigation of the rumors and reports of mistreatment of the Africans by European powers. What I find really cool is that Burroughs doesn't just forget about that. There are consequences to that. So in Chapter 9, we are introduced to this African tribe that seems to be well armed, but also is carrying living equipment with them, such as pots and so forth. So I like that Burroughs has a reason and motivation for John Clayton going to Africa in the first place. But he also has a consequence happen for John Clayton not achieving his mission. Burroughs narrates that this tribe of Africans were in greater fear of some attack from the rear than of any unknown threat in front of them. They had been harassed for rubber and ivory. Rubber trees, I don't think are in Africa. I know there are rubber trees in South America, but I could be mistaken on that. Regardless, they killed the white officer and his troop and are now fleeing. It is stated that they had gorged after the attack and now have plenty of meat. The meat is heavily implied to be human flesh, as this is a tribe of cannibals. Now I think Burroughs makes it clear that this tribe was in fact mistreated by their taskmasters. However, he also alludes to the fact that them coming here will affect Tarzan, his ape tribe, and the other members of the animal kingdom that call this place home. Now Burroughs narrates that it was a long time before they dared to venture deep into the jungle, due to the abundance of lions and leopards. And here I'm going to just say that I find it amusing that Burroughs, clearly not knowing much about either, it's like he thought lions and leopards were cool, and decided to throw everything he associated with living in a jungle into his book, which I find a little amusing, especially in contrast with the facts of lions living in Saharas, not in jungles. Now, shortly after this, Kulonga, who we are told is the son of the chief, set out deeper into the jungle, and he kills Kayla with a poisoned arrow. Tarzan hears the sounds of the commotion and is grief-stricken, as Kayla was the only one who showed him love. He pursues Kulonga and finds him hunting a boar. Here he has mixed feelings. On the one hand, he desires to avenge Kayla. On the other, here is another human, and we see Tarzan's intelligence at play, despite having been raised among wild animals. He, seeing the effect of the arrows firsthand, which are poisoned, he decides to wait until a more opportune time. Kulonga sleeps in the branches of a certain tree, and in the morning his bow and arrows are gone. Now his terror sets in, for he is without his spear, as recovering it was imprudent due to the other apes of Kayla's tribe charging towards him. Now all he has is his knife. His best course of action is to try to quickly make it back to his village. Tarzan, wanting to discover the intended destination of Kulonga, lets him make his way back, but follows in the wake of Kulonga with his rope. Once Tarzan sees the village of Kulonga and the destination of the cannibal obvious, Tarzan hurls his noose and, pulling Kulonga up, he ends the life of Kulonga by stabbing him with his knife, and Burroughs narrates that Kala was avenged. I would like to point out that Tarzan does not allow Kulonga to die a slow, grievous death by, say, hanging Kulonga, which Tarzan could have done, but ends his life quickly by stabbing him. We can learn a few things from this, namely that while Tarzan does have a savage nature, torturing his victims is not a part of that, which I think makes sense as Tarzan was raised by wild animals. Most animals, especially of the predator and carnivorous sort, will end the life of their prey swiftly. A spider poisons his or her prey. A snake poisons or constricts their prey. Cats deliver a bite to the neck, etc. Now, at this point, Burroughs asserts that Tarzan was raised by beasts, so how can we judge him? Tarzan had contemplated eating Kulonga, which, for one raised by animals, I think makes sense. He did not know if such a thing was deemed appropriate or not by mankind. Did men eat men? Tarzan cannot bring himself to do such an act, and Burroughs attributes Tarzan's repulsion to hereditary instincts ages old, and by such saved himself from committing a worldwide crime. Chapter 10 of Tarzan of the Apes begins with Tarzan perched up in the branches of a tree, and Burroughs informs us that he is overlooking the recently discovered village of the cannibals. Tarzan is curious and wishes to learn more about those who, in appearance, resemble himself, according to Burroughs' narration. Due to Tarzan's wild life, but also due to being brought up by animals, Tarzan believed that all those not of his tribe should be assumed to be his enemies. Therefore, he fully accepted to kill or be killed should he be discovered, and as such, he proceeded with as much stealth as he could muster. Tarzan happens upon one woman who is applying the poison to the arrows, and is how Tarzan learns what makes the arrows so lethal, noting the great care she takes in handling them. Tarzan really wants these arrows. He only needs a distraction to permit him to make his theft. Then one presents itself. Someone has discovered the body of Kulonga, and all rush to where he is, allowing Tarzan to easily steal the arrows. Tarzan leaves the village of the cannibals and meets Sabor. Using his newly acquired poison arrows, Tarzan loses 3 of them at Sabor, but is then forced into melee battle, and Tarzan switches to his knife, and Sabor is soon slain. Here is where we see another example of Tarzan's cockiness. Returning to the tribe of apes, he shows them the skin of Sabor, the lioness, and begins boasting about his achievement. Quote, "See what Tarzan, the mighty killer, has done. Who else among you has ever killed one of Numa's, the lion's people?" End quote. At this, Kerchak goes mad and lunges at Tarzan and challenges him to battle. Burroughs does a good job of contrasting the physiques of the two fighters in this battle. On the one side, the immense bulk of Kerchak, the bull ape, and the more lithe frame of Tarzan. Now, if you recall back to Tarzan's first gorilla battle, he only won because of his knife. Here, Burroughs puts Tarzan in a situation where in the battle he loses his knife, though it is lodged in the body of Kerchak. Tarzan bests Kerchak and thus becomes the king of the apes. So I like how Tarzan's feats start at 0, and gradually he performs greater and more impressive feats, to the point that the reader gradually isn't too worried when Tarzan faces an ape or gorilla. So chapter 12 begins with going over Tarzan's responsibilities as king of the apes, none of which are extensive or arduous. However, they do infringe on Tarzan's freedom and liberty, which he has been used to for much of his life. He is much more restricted with visiting the cabin of his birth father to read the books, or the cannibals' village to raid arrows or play pranks on them, or also to explore the jungle. And we come to some narration by Burroughs that Tarzan had grown distant and apart from the apes. There's also a hint that Tarzan thinks he could best a full-grown ape without knife or arrows, but is unsure how to combat against the fangs of the gorillas. The matter is soon taken completely out of Tarzan's control when Turcos, who by description is set up to be an unlikable bully, he is hitting the mate of another ape. Both the ape Turcos is abusing and her mate are older in years and are far past their prime. This is a thing that is made clear to be against the rules of the tribe. Tarzan gives Turcos a chance to desist without resorting to violence. This is of no avail, and he rushes Turcos. The author narrates that what allowed Tarzan to survive this battle is the thing that makes man superior to the beasts, his ability to reason. In short, Tarzan's intellect. Tarzan comes up with a plan to attempt to get onto Turcos' back and stab the brute to death. Once he got to Turcos' back, Turcos violently hurled about, trying to dislodge Tarzan, which caused Tarzan to lose his knife. From Turcos thrashing about, which caused Tarzan to lose and regain his hold, he accidentally stumbled upon a half-Nelson wrestling grip and immediately realized the advantage it gave him and strove to repeat the position with his other arm. Once accomplished, Tarzan became very much in control of the battle and of Turcos. After this battle and forcing Turcos to surrender, Tarzan consults with the older apes and relinquishes his kingship, and he leaves the apes. Now, one thing that I like with Burroughs is certain events have consequences. Lord Greystoke had been sent to investigate and confirm the reports of abuse towards the Africans. He never reached there, and those reports were true. So now we have the cannibals who live in some proximity to Tarzan, having fled their abusive taskmasters. Here, Tarzan chooses to spare Turcos, and this will have consequences later, as we shall see. He doesn't have things happen and forget about it. I am pleasantly impressed with this, especially the matter that brought Lord Greystoke to Africa in the first place. Tarzan reaches the place where his father's cabin is, and he sees people coming in boats to the spot. Many of them are of Caucasian origin. The author has this theme that I enjoy, that all people, regardless of ethnic origin, have the potential for barbarous acts. We see this first with the mutineers in the beginning of the book. We see this again with the cannibals. Just because they were humans did not spare them from maliciousness, such as torturing their victims, which they have been shown to do. And here we have another case. Some of the people here are rough-looking individuals, and one tricks another to look in a certain direction and kills him with a revolver. At this sudden intrusion, once safe to do so, Tarzan inspects the inside of his father's cabin, and the place is a mess. However, his prized possessions are safe. He writes a message and pins it on the door of the cabin and retreats into the jungle to watch and observe. Now, this is a part of the story where we have something of a repeat of what happened in the beginning. The sailors are rebelling and honestly acting more like brutish pirates than anything else, and are leaving Jane Porter, her aged father, Esmeralda, a negress from the U.S., John Clayton, and Samuel T. Philander, an assistant to Professor Porter. Now, the same sailor who had murdered his companion attempts to murder John Clayton, but Tarzan, watching, hurls his spear and strikes this man. He doesn't kill him, but he is struck, and proof that, as the notice stated, that he was watching is very much confirmed. Now, if you've watched the Disney movie, what's going on here, and the significance of some of these characters, are very different from that, as is Tarzan himself, as we've seen. Firstly, Professor Porter and Jane are not here on a scientific expedition to study apes. They are actually here on a treasure hunting mission, and it is due to the treasure that the sailors have rebelled against them. William Clayton is not a villain. He is actually a very honorable, straight-up man. But as we've seen, Tarzan at least learns how to read and write without assistance from the porters. Tarzan, upon seeing Jane, has an immediate liking for her, and he likes Clayton, Professor Porter, Samuel T. Philander, and Esmeralda by default of their association with Jane. The mutineers, and in particular Snipes the sailor he had speared, Tarzan has a strong dislike for. Seeing that they are in enmity with Jane and her acquaintances, Tarzan purposes to watch closely. Once he is sure Jane and Esmeralda are safe, Tarzan goes off into the jungle after Clayton to see why he went into the jungle, and here we have a segment that makes it clear to Tarzan the navigation of the jungle are very obvious, and subtle warning signs that danger is near, all is crystal clear. But to Clayton, who is fresh from civilization, they are not. He might as well be blindfolded. I quite enjoy themes like this. You have themes along these lines in some of the Conan stories too. I also enjoy stories where you do have someone fresh from civilization, and that person learns to survive in the wilderness, such as with Tarzan's father in the beginning of the story, or in the Swiss Family Robinson. Tarzan escorts Clayton back to the cabin on the beach, and both men witness a lioness crawling into the cabin where Jane and Esmeralda are residing. Tarzan pulls the lioness out, and applying a full Nelson hold on the lion, he breaks her neck, killing the creature. With Jane and Esmeralda safe, Tarzan retreats back into the jungle to search for Mr. Philander and Professor Porter, and it is with them that Chapter 16 begins, and this segment is very amusing. Both of them are having an intellectual debate on matters of history, science, and other topics, and Professor Porter believes he is walking through a garden versus being in the middle of an African jungle. And upon seeing a lion loose and not in its cage, states the intention of reporting this to the director of the zoological garden. The scene is more a comedic moment in the book, as opposed to showing how ill-equipped the civilized man is in coping with the untamed wilds. Overall, I really enjoyed this chapter. It is a relatively light-hearted and comical chapter. Tarzan ensures the safety of both Professor Porter and Mr. Philander, and sees them safely back to the cabin. Chapter 17 begins with some narration by the author, and here we are very much having a repeat of the beginning. Supplies are being left for the well-being of Jane and her acquaintances by the mutineers, and they will be left much like with John Clayton and the Lady Alice. The crew abandons Jane and everyone, who learn the actual fate of John Clayton and his wife Alice, and they bury what remains of their bodies, including the corpse of Kayla's infant. So the mutineers find a place to bury the chest of treasure, the cause of the crew committing mutiny in the first place. They are burying it in a place with the hope of finding it at a later time. Tarzan, however, is watching. Tarzan digs up the chest, and taking it out, he brings it to a location of his choosing and imitates what he had just seen. I really like how Burroughs depicts Tarzan. I think he does a good job of portraying someone raised by wild animals. He is still human, so his intellect is superior to that of the animals, but at the end of the day, he has been raised by beasts, and is ignorant on many things. And many of his actions reflect his upbringing very nicely, such as his mistrust of humans in general. His harassment of the cannibals is a combination of his mischievous nature, but also indicates that he doesn't know any better, which makes perfect sense. If we think back to when Tarzan first found the knife, he proceeds to play with it, basically, by hacking up anything it could. His taunt on Tublat, and especially the roping of his fellow apes, is another example. And lastly, we have the harassment of the cannibals. It is merely another game. Another thing I like, and we will see this later in the book, is the character progression. He starts off having zero survival chance, but he slowly climbs that ladder. Until now, there's nothing he can't best in the jungle. He has learned to read and write, and eventually we will see him enter civilization. But this act, too, will have consequences. And I like how Burroughs has consequence for acts done versus not having any bearing or effect. Now, as everyone is settling down to sleep, Tarzan is watching them, in particular Jane. And once she settles down to sleep, he takes the paper she had been writing on, as he is curious what she had been saying and what her thoughts were. From this, he learns that they have a very limited food supply and do not know how to acquire more, being strangers to the jungle. He also learns of things he had no knowledge of, namely a place called America. But learning that they do not know how to supply food, Tarzan ensures they will not go without, providing them with kills of game and food in general. It is clear Tarzan is very much in love with Jane, though he doesn't understand his feelings. Repeatedly, Tarzan purposes to meet these people and communicate with them through writing notes. But due to his upbringing, Tarzan has the timidness of a wild animal, and like a wild animal, he fears to confront these people, despite them being obviously harmless and good-natured. So while Tarzan is composing a love letter for Jane, his ears pick up the sound of an anthropoid moving through the jungle, followed by a scream. Dropping the letter by the cabin, he goes off, and Chapter 19 begins. Chapter 19 begins with some narration where, ever since Tarzan had left, there had been much turmoil, as Turcos was a cruel leader. However, when Tarzan left, he gave them some advice. He told them if they have a cruel leader, to instead of a solo challenge against said ruler, have 2, 3, or more of them oppose such a ruler and drive him off. This is what happened to Turcos. He was driven away, and he considered Tarzan responsible. And seeing the semblance between Tarzan and the white girl Jane, he stole her, hence the scream that Tarzan heard. Tarzan goes to the location that the scream had originated, and surveying the area, noting the tracks and evidence of some struggle there, he is instantly informed of what happened, as if he had witnessed it himself firsthand. Speeding through the jungle, the author narrates about Tarzan's wondrous sense of smell, comparing it to that of a bloodhound, and comments on how some believe man has weaker senses than the animals, but they are in fact just weaker from lack of use and need, have in essence atrophied. I do not know if this is true or not, but it would not surprise me if this was indeed fact, even if this hypothesis of the authors is false. It is still an interesting speculation, though again, I suspect that there is more truth than falsehood with it. Tarzan catches up to both Turcos and Jane, and the latter is at first relieved, but then wonders how any could vanquish something like the ape who had captured her. I would like to contrast this whole initial introduction of Jane and Tarzan with the Disney version. The Disney version is extremely tame by comparison, ultimately boiling down to Tarzan rescuing Jane from some very angry baboons in a comically over-the-top chase scene. Compare that with this. Jane is kidnapped by an adult gorilla, and Tarzan has to fight said gorilla in hand-to-hand combat. This would be one intense action scene in a movie, with moments like this. I'm not surprised that there were both comic books and graphic novels of Tarzan. Again, the book is a very different beast from the movie. It's a night and day comparison. The book does not pull any punches whatsoever. Tarzan, after rescuing Jane, takes her with him into the jungle, and then we shift focus from Tarzan back to the beach with Clayton and Jane's father and the rest. A boat of French officers is anchored at the beach, and the Arrow, the ship of mutineers that had stranded Jane and her associates, is also there. This all will be important developments later. Hearing of what has recently happened, the officers volunteer to go into the jungle in search of Jane. Chapter 20 begins with some narration by the author, basically making it clear That while Jane was just a dangerous situation with a wild beast and is with a human just as wild and savage and has no idea where Tarzan is taking her, she feels absolutely safe. Much of this chapter is what I would call Tarzan courting Jane. He keeps her safe, brings her food, they talk by writing notes back and forth, etc. One thing I would like to touch on is while you or I would want to escort Jane immediately back to the beach so that her father and friends would know that she is all right and unharmed, Tarzan obviously does not do this. But I think this course of action makes perfect sense when one considers that Tarzan is a wild individual raised by beasts. Many of the what we would call common decency or courtesy is fully ignorant of, again reflecting his upbringing very well in my mind. We see this very evident again in the same chapter. Tarzan does escort Jane back to the beach. He indicates the cabin in plain view, but he himself remains concealed within the jungle. She takes his hand and would have brought him to her father so that she could tell her father who had saved her and what lengths he went to in order that her safety and well-being were ensured. Tarzan, however, being as wild and timid as the beasts themselves, he withdrew and shook his head. We now go back to when the French soldiers and Clayton went into the jungle to search for Jane. Chapter 22 is a bit more dramatic compared to the previous one, as will be soon seen. The French officer D'Arnot was in the lead when black warriors sprung up all around him, and before his pistol could be drawn, he himself was dragged into the jungle. Hearing his cry, his men, not knowing the cause of it, rushed forward. All they knew was that it was a warning of danger. Rushing past the point where D'Arnot had been captured, a spear was thrown, and then a volley of arrows. A rather brilliant tactic by the blacks. While the cannibals are an antagonistic force in the story, I really like the tactics Burroughs gives them here. They ambush one who is isolated. He cries out. They then capture him and drag him off while themselves fading into the jungle, but still present. They wait for the others to pass. Then one hurls a spear, and a volley of arrows is loosed. Keep in mind that these arrows are likely poisonous too. Excellent tactics on their part. Burroughs here does a good job of painting an intense, heated battle in only a few words. However, night falls, and the second in command orders they make camp, as the blacks have retreated since they cannot see the trail, and their commander has been taken captive. The scene jumps from that to detailing what the group of blacks who captured D'Arnot did. They kept on their way back to their village with D'Arnot. Those keeping a lookout for the village and seeing their fellow warriors return with a prisoner, there is soon great excitement within. And if you recall what was said earlier about captured prisoners, especially white ones, the reader will immediately concur that D'Arnot is with high probability in for an anguishing night of torture and then will be eaten. Again, Tarzan has many elements that would be great for an action thriller movie. While I, in almost all cases, favor the source material over film adaptation, I could still appreciate a hypothetical Tarzan movie that is accurate to the source material. Now here Burroughs narrates an explanation as to what the motivation for the blacks' torture and cannibalism is. They don't just torture because evil pagan cannibals. There is a reason, and I really have to give Burroughs credit here. I appreciate the attempt at nuance and circumstance, even though these blacks are an antagonistic force in the jungle. The reason is, remember why Tarzan's father was coming to Africa in the first place? And why the blacks earlier were acting fearful as though running from something? It's all tying together. John Clayton was sent to investigate rumors and reports of abuse. The blacks rebelled against their taskmasters and fled into the jungle. In fact, Burroughs acknowledges that the savagery of the blacks is cruel, but he makes the assertion that they had received crueler barbarities practiced upon them, executed by their white taskmasters, and it was due to these cruelties that the blacks tortured their white prisoners, which just cements my earlier point. that Burroughs doesn't spare anyone. We have examples of everyone in unfavorable light: the beasts, sailors, humans, white man, colored men, etc. None are spared, and I do think this is very noteworthy. Tarzan may not be on the same literary scale as J.R.R. Tolkien's writings or Robert Jordan, but the thought he put into this is pretty good nonetheless. The torture of Diarna begins, and he purposes to show them how an officer and a gentleman dies. He would not cry out. He would die as honorably as his circumstances allowed. We swing to Tarzan's perspective, who rushed through the jungle straight to the village. He has seen this procedure so many times that he knows practically to the minute how long it has been going on. And since neither the death blow nor mutilation has been done to Diarna yet, there is still time. Tarzan emits the challenge of a bull gorilla, and then he ropes one of the blacks, pulling him up into the trees. The blacks are terrified and scatter, leaving Diarna completely alone. I want to note, Tarzan's previous pranks on the blacks helped to build their terror and dread of him, making this approach at a rescue far more likely to be successful. Without those pranks, this might not have worked. Again, everything ties together, and there are consequences to various happenings. Tarzan releases Diarna and carries him away. Chapter 22 cuts back to the surviving French soldiers returning to the cabin, and some wounded. Some of them are dead. There is the setup for something of a love triangle, so Clayton returns and is overjoyed to see Jane safe. Now previously, he never called her Jane, it was always Miss Porter. Here, he addresses her as Jane, and Burroughs places emphasis and importance on this. Jane also takes it as an indication that he has strong feelings for her, and it terrifies her, because of her attraction to Tarzan. We will see later on, but towards the final chapters, Jane battles with herself who to choose, Tarzan or Clayton. Now in chapter 23, we jump back to Tarzan and Diarna, who, through the exchanging of notes, communicate. Tarzan asks Diarna how to learn to speak. Diarna, being more familiar with French, teaches Tarzan that, leading to the ironic predicament of Tarzan. An English-born man is more familiar with French and speaks English in a French accent. Tarzan nurses Diarna back to health and makes sure he is able to return before escorting Diarna back to the cabin on the beach. Once when Diarna is well, Tarzan escorts Diarna back to the cabin, but it is deserted. While Diarna was recovering, the others had left, Jane herself being the most reluctant. They did, however, leave behind many wonderful belongings, as thanks for Tarzan's generosity, protection, and for his personal comfort. Seeing that everyone, and in particular Jane, was gone, Tarzan flees, rushing through the jungle, trying to escape himself and his thoughts. He begins questioning himself, asking himself if he is ape or man. If ape, then he will leave one of his own if the fancy took him. If man, then he will return and protect his fellow man. Ultimately, he returns to continue aiding Diarna. Here he reads the letters left for him and learns from Jane's letter that if Tarzan is unable to return, she will have to return with the others and will return to Baltimore in America. Now here we see an indication that Tarzan's world is suddenly expanded. All he knows is Africa. There are entire oceans out there with other lands. He proposes to set for the nearest settlement with other men that would have boats. After some discussion, they both come to an agreement. Now Tarzan, despite all odds, has survived and thrived in the jungles of Africa. He is at the top of the food chain, the apex predator. Here he is at the top. But Burroughs is about to put Tarzan in a setting where he is completely inept, and nothing of his life has prepared him for, in the slightest, civilization. Even something as simple as eating cooked food and with utensils is a loathsome chore to him. Now Tarzan's father kept a journal in French, a language that Tarzan never learned to read. Now with Diarna as a friend, he has someone who can reveal the secrets in its pages. Tarzan is the son of John Clayton, and with the chance occurrence of Tarzan leaving his fingerprints on the journal as an infant, there's the means of proving if Tarzan is indeed the son of John Clayton. I really appreciate the note to detail and setup that Burroughs does throughout this book, and that various actions have consequences. When they reach civilization again, we have some character growth for Tarzan. Tarzan sees some black workmen and workwomen and immediately pulls his bow out, as his experience has shown him that blacks can and will kill him if he doesn't kill them first with his poisoned arrows, and says as much to Diarna. Diarna is of course appalled at this, even if it has some understandable practicality. He tells Tarzan to wait until the blacks make an attempt to spring on him, not to assume they will. If they do, then of course defend yourself, but don't assume they will purely because other blacks have or would. I really like this character growth, and I think Tarzan's hard black and white view of things makes perfect sense when you consider where and how he grew up. They introduce themselves to the guard in charge and are permitted into the settlement. Chapter 26 begins with some brief narration discussing how Tarzan used to have some timidity regarding how many people lived there, the abundance of the buildings, and living in a large city as well. Previously, he had strong contempt for the use of utensils, and while maybe he still prefers to eat with his fingers, you wouldn't know it. Again, I really like the character growth. It could arguably be rushed at moments versus us, the reader, experiencing the growth, but I think it's serviceable. If it was more gradual, it would make this book significantly longer. So during his stay in the city, Tarzan becomes something of a wonder for two reasons. A drunk black in his alcohol-induced crazed rage rushes Tarzan, who easily defends himself without breaking a sweat and without killing him. The second is talk of lions comes up. Now Tarzan and Diarna had strived to maintain secrecy regarding Tarzan's origins, but one addresses Tarzan and inquires Tarzan's take on lions, whether they are bold or cowardly, as that had been the point of contention, and seeing as Tarzan grew up in Africa, Tarzan must surely have some opinion on the matter. Tarzan notes that both parties are correct regarding the nature of lions, and the difference is due to the particular lions each has encountered. Some are bold, others are not. And here we see some obvious signs of character development. He remarks, "But one might as well judge all blacks by the fellow who ran amok last week, or decide that all whites are cowards because one has met a cowardly white." End quote. Which is a great sign of growth in contrast to his first impulse a chapter or so back. Tarzan also has a very interesting philosophy in hunting. He enjoys knowing that what he hunts has just as much ability to harm him as he does the prey he is hunting. He would not enjoy a hunt where he had rifles and a gun bearer. He would feel the lion would have very little chance, and the enjoyment of the hunt would be decreased greatly. I find this philosophy interesting, and it makes me think of when I play video games, in particular RPGs. It's cool seeing the character grow and be able to squash enemies left and right, but my favorite fights are ones where I really have to plan and strategize. The enemy in question is just as able to kill me as the player character is him. In Dragon Quest XI, for example, I think my favorite boss fight is fighting Mordegon. This sparks some sarcastic bantering with some over-the-top, or so they think, assertion, remarking sarcastically that Tarzan must prefer to go naked and armed only with a jackknife to quell the king of beasts, little knowing how close to accurate this is. Ultimately, a wager is made. Tarzan going into the jungle, as he has said, armed only with his rope. Tarzan considers this nothing, laughing about it. The others consider this foolishly bold, and when he doesn't return soon, figure he must be dead or injured, and are going to dive into the jungle to rescue him. Ultimately, Tarzan, of course, wins the wager and returns unharmed. Diarna takes Tarzan to a police officer's station, and they are shown how fingerprinting works. Tarzan, curious, obliges to see how his prints look like, as no two are the same afterwards. Diarna procures the journal of Tarzan's father, and asks if there are any similarity in the prints in the book and either Tarzan's or his own. The officer requests to keep the journal as he wants the expert's opinion, but he believes there is some similarity with one of the sets of fresh prints and those in the journal. We'll just put a pin in that. Chapter 27 cuts to a place somewhere in America, and we are with Jane and friends again. So remember how Jane remarked how her father had borrowed money from a particular individual, and she was apprehensive about it? Yes, we are being introduced to said person. It is made clear that Mr. Candler desires Jane, but she, on her part, dislikes him, very strongly, in fact. Mr. Candler is making sure he still has Professor Porter's support in the Union. Now, the author narrates that the conversation always makes Professor Porter uncomfortable, but he doesn't know why, as it is a good match. Mr. Candler is not a bad-looking man and is a man of means. Mr. Candler wants to arrange the marriage at once, as he feels threatened by Mr. Clayton, who is often around Jane and has recently inherited quite the sum. Jane and Mr. Candler exchange words alone, and it is clear he is something of a villain. He is wealthy, yes, but he is in fact effectively buying Jane. By financially supporting Professor Porter and not asking for a return, Professor Porter is in a position where he has to approve of the union despite the wishes of Jane and with no way to repay. He is ruined otherwise. If only the treasure had not been lost. It's too bad it had never been recovered. Such a shame no one ever found it. Jane and her father moved to a farmhouse in Wisconsin. Jane goes for a walk and a fire breaks out and spreads. Down the road comes a black car and out comes a black-haired giant. He wakes a sleeping Clayton, informing him of the danger and asks about the whereabouts of Miss Porter. The black-haired giant instantly takes charge of the situation, devising a plan to assure everyone's safety. He himself goes in search of Jane, swinging through the trees, and yes, it is Tarzan. He finds Jane. Her escape had been cut off from the fire, and Tarzan grabs her and whisks her away from danger. They exchange words. He clarifies that he and the letters from Tarzan were one and the same person, not two separate entities, as she had thought. Now, Tarzan is a little bit of an enigma. He is English-born, raised in Africa, can read and write English, speaks French fluently, speaks English in a French accent, having been taught French first, as it was what Diarna understood best how to teach. In his car, yes, clearly Tarzan has learned how to drive, and assumedly has a driver's license now. Tarzan learns that Jane is going to marry one she despises because of money owed. Tarzan and Jane safely arrive at the cottage that Tarzan had previously suggested as a meeting place for everyone once all escaped the fire. Mr. Candler arrives with a priest or some other similar individual, and it's clear he intends on insisting on a justice of the peace form of ceremony, and Jane and her acquaintances have just had an ordeal of escaping from a fire. Yeah. Jane expresses the desire to wait a few days under the circumstances of the fire and escaping from it. Candler refuses and makes a move to forcibly drag Jane before the Reverend. Before he can take another step upon putting his hands on Jane, a hand falls on his arm and another on his throat. Mr. Candler finds himself being suspended above the floor and being shaken. Jane jumps to intervene, not for concern for Mr. Candler, but for Tarzan. Understanding what would happen to Tarzan if he were to kill Mr. Candler, and not wanting him to face that. She entreats Tarzan to spare Mr. Candler for her sake, and Tarzan responds with a line I derive great amusement from. "Do you wish for this to live?" I just find this line highly entertaining. Jane clarifies that she doesn't wish for Candler to die at Tarzan's hand. She doesn't want Tarzan to be a murderer. A little ironic, considering the multiple times Tarzan has killed a man already. Mr. Candler leaves after Tarzan confirms from Candler's own mouth that he won't molest or bother Jane further. Tarzan assures Professor Porter that he will be able to pay Mr. Candler back and his honor will be maintained as the treasure has been found. Now we jump to a section of Jane has conflicted feelings. She has adoration for Tarzan and respect for Clayton. who to marry. Clayton has money, is a gentleman, well-raised, he can fit into society. Tarzan would always struggle to fit in. She isn't trying to approach this with reason versus pure emotion. Jane is a great character. I really like her a lot. She agrees to Clayton's proposal to marry him as she now has nothing standing in the way. Later, Tarzan approaches Jane also proposing to her, and she feels she has made a grave error. The depths of Tarzan's love is deep, and he has done much to win her love and affection, but she has already said yes to Clayton. Now a telegraph arrives for Tarzan, confirming he is indeed the heir to the late Lord Clayton. The fingerprints matched. At this point, Tarzan has the ability to take everything from Cecil Clayton: land, house, estate, finances, everything. Here, Tarzan does a very selfless thing. Being asked who he was and how he got to Africa, Tarzan says simply, "I was born there. My mother was an ape, and of course, she couldn't tell me much about it. I never knew who my father was." Tarzan could take everything from Clayton, but he chooses not to ensure that Jane has a happy life with the one she has chosen. This book is interesting in that it doesn't have the happy ending of guy gets the girl, and really turns expectations on its head because as you read the book, you really are anticipating that Tarzan will get Jane in the end, but he doesn't. So anyone who reads Tarzan will note that there are some inaccuracies. A very easy example is that Sabor the lioness is in the jungle when the lions don't live in jungles. They live in the Sahara. Additionally, lions live in prides, so Sabor would have been accompanied by at least other lionesses, if not also a lion. However, this was written at a time when Africa was not well known. In my opinion, there was a fascination with Africa. It was a place of wonder and mystery. There were strange and dangerous animals, dense jungles, etc. Now, Africa, of course, is still a fascinating place to visit, but it has lost much of its mystery and intrigue. With the mystery gone, the excitement element is also gone. It's kind of like America when it was discovered. It was a strange and dangerous world, but also exciting. The excitement and mystery elements are gone. All that to say, I do wish some of the elements in the book were more accurate, especially when compared to something like Ben-Hur, which, from what I can tell, had a lot of research put into it, a book written at an older time than Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes. I do not know what avenues for researching Africa were available at the time. Part of me wishes it had been better researched, but I also still enjoy the book quite a lot. In fairness, though, this is an unspecified part of Africa. The book does not say where on the African continent this all takes place. It could be a fictional continent based off of Africa, and very little would change about this book. I enjoyed reading this again, and I had fun talking about this book. You all take care, and feel free to leave some book recommendations. I will see you with another video at a future time. Most likely, my next video will be about Treasure Island. I am not sure when that will come out. I am currently making notes on that right now, but look forward to that. Until then, happy reading and farewell.